Dr. John Diggs has practiced medicine for over 35 years and is a diplomat of the American Board of Internal Medicine. He's also a motivational speaker and a guest on national television and radio programs. He is a frequent commentator on human sexuality and adolescent health. His topic for this session, the consequences of sexual immorality. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. John Diggs.
Good morning. I want to start off with simply a verse. And that verse is from Genesis, and it says, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." That comes out of Genesis chapter 2. And in case you're still believing Genesis was the mean God, and the Old Testament is the mean God, and the New Testament is the nice God. It also comes up again from Jesus directly in Matthew 19 and Mark 10. And this answers a whole lot of questions. It says, for example, the two shall become one flesh. So the only possibility for any type of marriage is two people. It also says a man shall cleave to his wife, which means there's only the possibility of complementarity in marriage. And number 3, it says the two shall become one flesh, not one family, not one household, but one flesh. And I'm speaking to you as a physician, as an MD, and I can tell you this is biologically 100% true. So I want to ask a couple questions. You know what, I hate when people tell you to do stuff like stand up if you got that. I'm not going to ask, but I thought about it. But I'd like a show of hands, and the reason for the show of hands is to demonstrate it for yourselves. Raise your hand if you were ever an egg. Okay, about 40% of people raise their hands. Raise your hand if you were ever a sperm. Now, for some reason, there's fewer hands raised. So I want to point out something very important to you, and the previous example of Shaquille O'Neal is very timely because I want to ask you a question. In a human cell, how many pairs of chromosomes are there? And let's take, for example, with the Shaquille O'Neal, somebody big. How many chromosomes would he have? Okay, pairs, 23, total chromosomes, 46. So, how about a newborn baby? How many chromosomes into each of its cells? The same. How about a child that hasn't been born yet? Okay. How many chromosomes in an egg? 23. How many in a sperm? 23. The new person comes about because you take the 23 plus the 23 and you get a new 46 that never existed before and will never be created again. So the answer is, here I am with a largely pro-life audience who still thinks that at some point they were an egg. You were never an egg. This is not like parts of a bicycle where you don't have a bicycle till you have the frame and 2 wheels. This is a miraculous, complete transformation where it forms something brand new that never existed before. You can't take it apart and put it back together. So there is an interesting fact about this, though. In order for a woman to become pregnant, it takes 1 egg and let's say 50 million sperm. Did those odds ever seem strange to you? 1 egg and 50 million sperm. Why is that? The simple question is, which I think all of you know, is that sperm's looking for an egg, men don't like to ask directions. Okay. So, but seriously, folks, that's what happens, and this answers all the questions that you might hear or the challenges about Jesus never addressed sexuality. He said the two shall become one flesh. That's a definitive, complete, and comprehensive statement. And I'm suggesting to you that these are some of the things you have to hold on to when you're making arguments as you face the world. So what are the consequences of sexual immorality? Well, there's a few things. First of all, you have to define immorality. Morality is defined by God. People will try to reframe, redefine morality, and part of the reason that Scott had to go through the things he went through was to tell you how to spot the lies. There is always, always a central lie. So I'm going to go through this from a different point of view, and I'm going to talk about the 3 consequences, which are basically the unwanted pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, and the disruption of social cohesion. Okay. And I'm going to do this the same way Jesus did, by telling stories, in part, and then I'm going to also impart some scientific facts for you. Additionally, the reason that Jesus told stories and parables was because only the people who were his people would understand what he said. So it's partly to reveal a truth and partly to hide the truth from others. Well, what I'm going to tell you today does not require me hiding it. The fact that people are clouded and ensconced in the culture in which we currently live, they hide the truth from themselves. They intentionally lie to themselves. And I'm going to give you an example of that later on, which is pretty striking regarding the topic of abortion. But first, I'm going to tell you the story of the Princess and the Barbarian. This story is in the prologue of a book called Sexual Suicide, or it's also called Men in Marriage, written by George Gilder. He wrote one version of the book, then he edited it and published a second version. And the book is astounding and amazing in that it describes a lot of things that are happening in society, and the book was published over 30 years ago. But this story, I think, will help you to understand and apply it to a lot of different circumstances. The Princess and the Barbarian. There was a princess who liked to wander around in the woods around her kingdom. Her mother and father were the king and the queen of the kingdom. The kingdom was surrounded by a wall for protection. She used to go out and wander in the woods and enjoy it. At some point, a barbarian arose in the woods who would attack the trade routes between their kingdom and another kingdom. And what happened is that the kingdom started to suffer because people didn't want to trade. They were always getting attacked. They were getting assaulted. They were getting robbed, all by a single barbarian who was very clever and knew the woods very well. The princess was told to stay inside the house, stay inside the castle for her own protection. But at some point, the desire to go back to the place she loved so much overcame her wisdom, overcame her parents' direction. She went out in the woods. The barbarian who was in the woods heard somebody coming and was ready to attack, something he did regularly. That's how he lived, by attacking people, robbing them, pillaging, etc. When he saw this woman, he thought it was the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen in his life, and it sort of stopped him. He didn't have a desire to attack her all of a sudden. Suddenly he had a desire to be with her, to hold her. So he went out to her presence. She ran, of course, frightened because she knew there's a barbarian in the woods. He's bigger, stronger, faster, catches her. So she's struggling at first, and then he realizes this is probably not the best way to win friends and influence people, and he takes a different approach. She thinks she wants to get away from him, but decides maybe talking to him, he'll calm down and she'll find a chance to escape, and that's exactly what happens. At some point, she finds a chance, escapes, and he's calling after her, and she says, "I'll be back next week." He doesn't believe her, but a week goes by, and she shows up again. They start walking and talking again. He still has other ideas, wants to take her back to his cave to see his etchings, and she starts meeting with him regularly, and they get to know each other pretty well. He wants her to come back to see his etchings. She says, "No, you have to do a couple things. One, you have to clear some land, maybe build a house, plant some crops so you don't have to beat up people to steal for money and for food." He thinks about this because he really loves what he's doing. She goes back to the castle, and she doesn't show up until he does something. 6 months later, he gets to her and gives the message, and she comes and actually sees that he's actually done this. At some point, she decides she wants to marry him. She tells her mother and father, the king and queen, and they're looking at her like she's crazy. "You want this barbarian to come live in our castle?" And they're arguing about this for a while until finally the queen realizes, "You know what, honey?" Talking to the king, "You were a bit of a barbarian yourself back in the day." What happens? King and queen grow old and die. Princess and the barbarian get married, become the new king and queen. Meanwhile, things have changed a little bit. The kingdom has started to prosper again. But later on, another barbarian arises in the woods, as they always do. The new king and queen have a princess who's heard new ideas that a woman should decide for herself what she wants to do. She goes out in the woods, even though the barbarian was there, and he convinces her to go back to his cave to check out his etchings. This also becomes a regular thing for them. Then, a king from another kingdom comes to see their kingdom to see how things are going. He sees the princess, the new princess, and says, my queen doesn't really understand me. I think I have a lot more in common with somebody of your generation. Meanwhile, the princess is really taken by this guy. He's got money, he's a king, he's sophisticated, he's got new ideas, and compared to the barbarian who's living in a cave, come on. The barbarian realizes the princess hasn't been showing up for a while because she's gone off with the new king. He doesn't know why, but she knows she's not there. This creates in him a level of frustration that he starts to pillage, beat up people, and steal again to a degree he never did before, because he has another level of frustration, another level of anger, another level of rage there. And the kingdoms both start to suffer again. So, what is the moral of the story? The first thing you need to look at is who are the people in the story. You have the princess, you have the barbarian, you have the king and the queen, and you have the neighboring kingdom. The king and the queen, of course, represent parents. The princess, of course, represents single women. So who's the barbarian? Single men. So the moral of the story is simply this. In order for any man to grow into becoming a king, he has to be civilized. The best person to civilize a single man is the object of his affection. Okay? So I'm laying this out there as a foundation, a story to give young people a vision for what needs to happen. When this doesn't happen, there are consequences, and we're going to talk about that as number 3. The first consequence we're going to talk about is pregnancy. The second consequence we'll talk about is the sexually transmitted diseases, and the third consequence is the loss of social cohesion, which is exemplified in this story. How many pregnancies each year? What's the consequence of a pregnancy? Let's say there's 1 million pregnancies, just for easy figuring. In general, in the United States, about a third of those come with live births, about a third have miscarriages, and about a third end in abortion. And in various subgroups, those numbers will be different. For example, if you look at people who self-identify as black in New York City, more than half of the pregnancies end in abortion. There are more black babies aborted in New York City than are born. Okay? Now, this is a very interesting situation because so often you hear black folks complaining about death at the hands of the police, at the hands of white racists. The reality is the most dangerous place for any black person in America is in his mother's womb. Okay? So we've talked about the nature of pregnancy. We talked about the consequences of pregnancy. Under most circumstances, pregnancy is a happy outcome. There's a woman named Obianuju who's from Nigeria, and she talks about, in her language, there's not even a word for abortion. So this whole concept that the women of the world are clamoring for abortion is not true. There are many cultures where abortion is not known in the same way. At the same time, abortion has been around for thousands of years. You can read about it in the Old Testament. The abortion happened after birth, but it's just as much of an abortion. They're killing off a child for some reason, to get better crops. In the case of what you see in the Old Testament, you read about the god Molech in Canaan. And they're actually putting the child to death as an offering to Molech. So abortion is not something new. You've heard details about the arguments that can be made, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the point is this: the pregnancy is not a problem unless somebody in the couple decides it's a problem. What is the consequence for women who have abortion? Well, you can see this a lot in Scandinavian countries where they have more socialized medicine, and what you find is that if you have women in 3 different categories, for example, giving birth, not being pregnant, or having an abortion, the highest rate of death is among those who've had abortion. They don't die from the abortion, they die from suicide, accidents, and murder. Sexually transmitted diseases. There's 8 we'll look at briefly. We're going to look at a couple, but there's 8 major ones that we deal with here in the United States. Trichomonas, syphilis, HIV, herpes type 1 and 2, gonorrhea, chlamydia, hepatitis B and C, and HPV. So sexually transmitted diseases, sometimes called sexually transmitted infections, same thing. How are they spread? Sexual intercourse. If you take one person who's virginal, another person who's virginal who don't have STDs, can they create an STD? No, they cannot. If a person has an STD, there's always a third person involved. Always. No exceptions. There's always a third person involved. So the sexually transmitted diseases I want to look at for a second would be trichomonas, which is a very common one. Then there's syphilis, which is primarily among men who have sex with men. And then there's HIV, herpes type 1, herpes type 2. We'll talk about that one in more detail, so we'll look at the next slide. Can you see this? Yes, you can. On the right is a detailed slide of the estimates of STDs, because it's difficult to come up with firm numbers. And what I did on the left was pick out a specific disease and show you how many men have been diagnosed or thought to be diagnosed and how many women. So for example, with trichomonas, you have 470,000 men and 470,000 men and 2,100,000 women. So 82% of the cases of trichomonas are in women. Now, if something is sexually transmitted, and it's mostly heterosexual sex, why do women have this number that's 80% compared to only 20% with the men? Any ideas? Because men have multiple partners. And what tends to happen, which we'll talk about a little bit in social cohesion, is that 20 to 30% of men are having sex with multiple partners. Large numbers of men are not having sex with anybody. Okay? Can you relate this to the Princess and the Barbarian story? Possibly. I think you will by the end of the talk. We'll look at another STD, genital herpes. I'm 66 years old. Back in my day, we'll call it, when I was training, 90% of genital herpes was caused by herpes type 2. 90% of genital herpes was caused by herpes HSV type 1. The difference is that HSV1 is usually cold sores. A lot of people have cold sores. You share glasses with people. You pick it up innocently in childhood. It has nothing to do with sex. Well, with the change in social mores, people are having a lot more oral genital contact, something which was not common for people born before 1964. Okay? So now when you go in, you could have genital herpes as type 1. You could have oral herpes as type 2. Does it really matter? Probably not. Both of them are permanent. Once you get herpes, you're going to have it forever. You can transmit it when you have an outbreak. Most transmissions happen when you don't have an outbreak. More importantly, they're not stopped by condoms. So when you look at the numbers, again, you see, 1.2 million women, and 600,000 men. Again, twice as many women as men. Part of the reason is because whether it's diagnosed or not. It's not simply that more women have it, it also has to be diagnosed. Men tend to ignore things unless they hurt or bleed, and if it goes away, then it's okay. Herpes comes and it goes away in terms of the outbreaks. HIV, this is the one that's gotten the lion's share of attention. I trained during the AIDS era, and what you see there is that this is a reversal of what you've seen elsewhere. The majority of the infections are men, 78%, and the fewer number are women. But one thing that has not happened, there was never this huge heterosexual HIV epidemic that was predicted. I mean, just looking at the numbers, you can see we're talking about 200,000 women compared to 1.2 million women with herpes. Okay, so the numbers are very different. HPV, human papillomavirus. Very interesting findings here. This is one place where you see the numbers are very similar. We're talking about 2 million men and 1.9 million women who can be diagnosed with HPV. It causes two major things, either warts or cancer. The cancer can occur in the cervix, the vulva, the vagina, the penis, the anus, and the throat. If you happen to see the news, several years ago, famous actor Michael Douglas had throat cancer, and it was from HPV, which he attributed to oral sex. Okay? Now, some people are trying to avoid pregnancy. That's their go-to, oral sex. There are groups of young people, I'm talking about people as young as 8th, 9th grade, they have oral sex almost as casually as they do shaking hands. This is the reality. So you find huge numbers of people with HPV, and many people don't know they have HPV. You've heard about the HPV vaccine, which I'm not going to address right now, but that's not an answer. I'll just put it that way. Okay. We're often told that condoms are the way to stop transmission of STDs, and I was involved with Dr. Tom Coburn, who's in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate at different times, and we presented a paper showing that condoms were very ineffective in stopping most of the 8 STDs that we look at the biggest. So what you see here is, although the effectiveness of condoms and microbicide use is not completely proven, there is sufficient evidence to support the promotion of the use by healthcare professionals as an important part of safe sex counseling. Now, normally, when you give a treatment, a doctor can tell you, if you do this, it'll reduce your chances of having that by this many percentage points. Nobody can do that with condoms. And part of the reason is because they don't have proof that condoms work in reducing transmission. But if you go to the CDC website, even now, in 2023, you're going to read about how the consistent use of the male latex condoms may reduce transmission of herpes. The key word in there is may. Yes. So I say this because that's what doctors go to place to get information about HSV or about any other STD. And they don't do a close reading of about exactly what's said, so they tend to rely on that as a safe reproach. So altogether, you're talking about 68 million people with sexually transmitted infections, according to the CDC, which is about 1 in 5. Now, I've been tested. I don't have any, but if we count across the room, we go 1, 2, 3, 4. It's him. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's her. 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's her. The point being here that these are statistical numbers. They are not individual affirmations of an STD, because sexually transmitted infections are sexually transmitted. So if 2 virginal people get together, even without testing, they will not create nor spread a sexually transmitted disease. A sexually transmitted disease implies the presence of a third person. Even if you get it off a toilet seat, for example, that's still a third person. Okay? So what you're seeing here is there's 68 million people with active infections in a year. This is from 2018. And you'll see that it also mentions there's 26 million newly acquired infections every year. Now, don't think you keep adding 26 million per year. That's not the way it works, because some people, for example, once you get herpes, you don't get a new herpes, you just have herpes. So the consequences of dealing with the question of sexually transmitted infections and the consequence of dealing with unwanted pregnancies has been this idea that we are sexual libertines. You should be able to do whatever you want because we can prevent pregnancies with oral contraceptives and other contraceptives, and we can eliminate unwanted pregnancies with abortion, and the sexually transmitted diseases aren't that bad, and you can always use condoms and prevent them. So the point is to create a level of loss of cohesion, which results in us having a lot of obsolete ideas. Masculinity becomes obsolete. Femininity becomes obsolete. Now, lest you think this is some idea that just came about in the 60s with feminism, no, that would not be the case. We'll talk about that briefly too, and we'll be going all the way back to Genesis to finish it out. Sex roles, obsolete. Monogamy, obsolete. This is supported by many things, such as the arts. You can't watch any television show, any movie, almost listen to any modern music that does not involve the idea that doing what you want to do is good, and having sex when you want to have sex is good, and if he's not Mr. Right, maybe he'll be Mr. Right now. And there'll be no consequences because you have all this other armamentarium to prevent the consequences you don't want. So this social cohesion starts to fall apart, again going back to The Princess and the Barbarian, because if I was going to identify one group, male versus female, who are having a crisis right now, I'd say it's males. The males don't know what it is to be a man. They're not directed on how to be a man because so much of masculinity has been roundly and singularly criticized. Is being strong masculine? Well, not if you're Leah Thomas. You want to be a girl and be strong and swim faster than all the girls. Not if you're a decathlon athlete like Bruce Jenner, who wants to be a girl. So all these roles get confused, and people's focus gets confused, and their vision gets confused. And the consequence is a complete loss of social cohesion. Right now, people assume that, they say, you know what, men are dogs, because they like to have multiple partners. Who allows men to have multiple partners? Okay? If women still stood a high chance of getting pregnant and respecting that pregnancy, they would be a lot more selective in who they have sex with. But the vision of the modern women, encouraged by almost every television show and every movie you can think of, is that women should control access to sex. And I think women should control access to sex. I mean, the way I look at it, men control access to relationships, women control access to sex, but women have stopped being selective. And then they complain about the guys being dogs. Well, think of the barbarian. The barbarian did not have to clear any land, did not have to build a house, did not have to plant some crops, did not have to be civilized, and he still got the princess. Was the barbarian happy with that? Ultimately, no. Initially, yes. So what do you see as you look around modern American society? You see more women going to college. And you have to think about this for a second. If it's 50-50, that's one thing, but when you start changing the sex predominance in a given thing, such as going to college, every point plus for one side is a point negative for the other side. So things change very rapidly. So for example, if it's 50-50 and women gain 5% and become 55, that means the men are 45% of college graduates. So that means of that 55% of women, at least 20% of them are going to have to be satisfied, if they're going to be married, being married to a man with less education than they have. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that most women don't want it. Women are always looking for a guy who's smarter, bigger, faster, stronger, earns more money than they do. Well, if college is indeed, which could be argued against, a way to higher income, the situation we're in now is setting up for a whole bunch of dissatisfied women and a whole bunch of frustrated single men. And if you look in prisons, it's 90% men in prison. And those are men who have not been civilized. So if the single strongest force into civilizing a man is to please the object of his affection, female sexual choices are actually undermining the civilization of men. When you undermine the civilization of men, you undermine the intact nuclear family. When you undermine the intact nuclear family, then a baby can be a threat. When the baby is a threat, your willingness to eliminate the baby reaches a low threshold. So when people tell you that they are not convinced this baby is alive, you know they are lying. How do you know they're lying? Because we're talking about those cameras that Scott mentioned. Women get an ultrasound of their baby when they want the baby, and it flies all over the internet to all their friends. They don't say, here is my clump of cells. They say, here is my baby. Okay. So the male-female wars that we're encountering, they didn't just start with feminism. They didn't start with Gloria Steinem. They didn't start with Betty Friedan. They started with the fall. I want to go over this verse more carefully than most people do. That's Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. After Adam and Eve sinned, Eve because she was deceived, Adam because he willfully did so, God pronounces a curse. And part of the curse in the woman is it says, your desire shall be for your husband. Has anybody ever read that? Sound familiar? Have you ever thought about what that actually means? Well, I have one of those books that nobody likes. It's called a concordance. I don't like it either. But it did give me some insight into something I never saw before. It says your desire shall be for your husband. I'm thinking, hey, that's a good thing. It's not a good thing. When you look at that word desire in Genesis chapter 4, you'll see when God is talking about Cain and Abel. And he says to Cain that sin desires you. And what he's saying is that sin will rule over you. When you bring the curse into the world, you don't just curse yourself, you curse the entire creation. So when it says your desire shall be for your husband, what it actually means is that women will have a natural, this is not something that Betty Friedan created. Women will have a natural desire to usurp male authority. It's a natural desire as part of the curse, not a part of the natural state of unblemished men and women, but part of the curse. Your desire will be to usurp authority from your husband. I should say husband. It's not just all males. It's not like all women are supposed to be subservient to all males. It's husband and wife relationship. So now what you're taught, what you hear is that this is supposed to be a partnership. Well, what happens with partnerships? Partnerships can be broken. They get broken all the time. Do you play tennis with the same person you played with 5 years ago? Probably not. Bridge? Any other game? No, because partnerships are broken. Partnerships are not a one-flesh relationship. Marriage is a one-flesh relationship. So now, how many times have you heard, I don't mind having a baby with you, but marriage is a little bit too serious. This is the modern mindset. This is the modern mindset. Having a child is less serious than getting married. Okay? So if you think about that, if you look at this, if marriage was ordained by God, if this is the way he directed male-female relationships to be, and people are saying, we don't need this, that means you don't have an intact nuclear family. The nuclear family is the building blocks of anything else in society. You cannot build a structure with faulty materials and expect it to stand. So you have all these babies being aborted. Do women know that they're killing a human being? Yes, they do. Planned Parenthood tells them it's a clump of cells. They might tell you it's a clump of cells, but a woman knows. Women are so smart it's crazy. Bothersome, crazy. Can't get away with anything. And so you see this, women will tell you in their honest moments. They'll tell you when they get pregnant again, they suddenly realize, you know what, I killed my first child. They'll tell you when they have the abortion the first time, but they do it out of desperation. And it takes something powerful, as the images that Scott mentioned, the images that convince you that, you know what, I know I might have financial problems. I know I'll probably be tied to this guy for the rest of my life on some level, even though I don't want to be. It was a mistake. But that child is dependent upon me. That's a natural, nurturing, maternal instinct. And the way our society is going now with the loss of social cohesion, that natural instinct is being suppressed. If you hear music that tells you that sex is great, babies are bad, people start to believe it. All of Western Europe is currently below replacement level. They don't have babies. Italy, core of the Vatican there, the core of Catholicism. When I was growing up, the Catholic families were big. They're not anymore. What changed? When you start to have your own children as your enemy, it's very difficult to keep that from bleeding out into other areas. It's not difficult, it's impossible. So what am I suggesting to you? What's my answer? My answer is the arguments need to be at the kitchen table, not at a conference, not at the school board, not in some chamber of legislature. The arguments need to be at the kitchen table with your own kids and with other people. And my basis of this is going to come straight out of Proverbs chapter 26. Answer not a fool, lest you become like him. Answer not a fool, lest you become like him. So you don't get into stupid arguments. The very next verse seems to contradict that verse. It says, answer a fool, lest he think himself wise. So what does that mean you have to do? It means, one, you have to exercise discernment, find out who you're talking to. Which type of fool are you talking to? Is this a place where you can actually make some inroads, or is it not? As Scott also mentioned, you're not responsible for the outcome, but you are responsible for your actions. So when somebody comes up with a stupid idea, if there's an opening, then yes, you should refute it. And if it's a really stupid idea, ignore it. Answer a fool, answer not a fool. At the kitchen table, with your own kids. Because even if you homeschool, there's still a lot of powerful outside forces talking to your kid. Not to mention just the mere fact that they need to have the ability not to look like, in their own eyes, that they're uneducated. You know, when they run into problems or questions they don't know how to answer, they should address them. But one of the things that I've learned, I'm a doctor. I run into other doctors who say things which are blatantly false. They lie. Who's the father of lies? They tell lies. And so one of the things that I suggest is that you look for the lie, because it's always there. You may not know it. I mean, for example, we're talking about STDs. You don't have to know that information that I know. But you do have to know that there are STDs. And despite the fact that we've been pushing condoms all along, you have to know where STDs come from. You have to know the fact that condoms don't stop them. And you have to know that they don't have to be. If two people who don't have STDs are together and they stay that way, there will be no new STDs. So, answer a fool, answer not a fool. Recognize that pregnancy is a good thing. God opens the womb and closes the womb. We don't. All we do is play with stuff that God's already made. Sexually transmitted diseases are created because of our fallen nature, and the loss of social cohesion is going to be a very difficult thing to come back from. But it's got to start somewhere, and it can be done. In the early 20th century, there was a purity movement when there were, some certain levels of debauchery were worse than what's happening now. What's happening now is digital and easily available and endorsed by all of our media. That didn't used to be the case. It wasn't endorsed by our media. But things can turn around. I'm not hopeless about it at all. Okay? And I don't think you should be hopeless about it at all. And that last one about the loss of social cohesion, again, is something that has to happen person by person. It's not going to happen by legislation. I know, as Scott acknowledged, and I do too, there's people in here who've had abortions. I know there's people who are on their second or third or fourth marriages or never got married and have kids scattered around. But God offers us forgiveness. We all make mistakes. Some of them are more visible than others. Some of us wear our sin on our bodies. But that's sin no worse than somebody who's not obese. It's there, but it's easier to see, but all of us have it. And we have to acknowledge that. So that's where I want to go back to Romans 1 and finish with that. Okay. Romans chapter 1. The main point of it, this part of the chapter, is that professing to be wise, they became fools. We say, yes, a man can become a woman. Yes, a woman can become a man. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Who says this? Doctors say this. Doctors say, I can change your sex. Therefore, God gave them up to uncleanness, to the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And then the next verse. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. Okay, the passions are there, but God gave them up to vile passions. In other words, He removed a lot of the impediments to following through on those vile passions. He gave them up. The women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Okay, so we're talking now about something that's not simply sinful, but also against the nature of a thing. You don't put a nail in with a baseball bat. Likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another. Burned. That's something powerful, something strong, something damaging. Burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful. Modern society says there's no shame. And receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which is due. Sexually transmitted diseases are something where you receive the penalty in yourself. Okay? Now this is written 2,000 years ago. Okay? Not in 2015. 2,000 years ago. So this, what we're experiencing, is not something new. It may be different in degree, different in presentation, but in nature it's the same. And then, And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do these things which are not fitting. In other words, your intellectuals, your so-called smart people who profess themselves to be wise, still support these things. Even if they don't do them themselves, they still support them. Why do they support them? Because if they support sin that they don't have themselves, they feel that will give them some latitude for the sins they do have to be supported. Okay? So the whole point I'm trying to make here is simply this. There are consequences to sexual immorality. Morality is defined by God. Marriage was created by God. Marriage is defined by God. Marriage is what's best for children. Marriage makes everything better. It's like butter. Makes everything better. Recognize that there is actually a difference between men and women, which everybody knows. And when people decide to accept a lie, they are usually deceiving themselves. And it is only in times of stress where sometimes that truth will come out, because the truth is there. It's not something that has to be discovered. It's already there. So I don't think I've told you anything that you didn't already know. You might have gotten fooled a little bit by the sperm and the egg, okay? But everybody that's sitting here passed through that stage. None of you was ever a sperm. None of you was ever an egg. You did not exist. It is only with that transformation at the moment of conception where something changed. And since then, you have not ceased to exist. Okay? And it's important to realize this because that if you understand some of those basic principles, it'll help you to engage some of the other issues that come up, which you may not have been familiar with. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that's coming up now that I never dreamed of. I mean, if a man has a girlfriend and he decides to have a sex change, does that make his girlfriend a lesbian? I never thought about it before. So there's going to be all kinds of things that will come up. Would you ever think that if you wanted to have a war, that you would fly a commercial plane into a building, as happened in 9/11? No. So the reason you need the basics, the foundation, is so that you can address the situations that you don't anticipate running into. So I'll stop. We can ask, and I have no problem answering questions anytime for the rest of the day. So thank you for your time. Thank you.